Welcome to the Esoteric Beat, where many people have asked me, "Do you know the secret?" And I'm happy to tell you, beats me. It's my great pleasure and honor to have the modern hermeticist Dan Attrell, a great pal of mine, on the show. How's it going, Dan?
It's going well. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So Dan has done some really awesome stuff in the field of esoteric studies, and I've invited him on today to talk about Marsilio Ficino, who he's been translating, as well as the great text of medieval astral magic, the Picatrix. Well, let's start, with what's fresh. You've just gotten finished, if I've understood this correctly, with the Ficino translation. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so it's just gone through peer review, and we've got a green light from the University of Toronto Press. So we've just got to get our final edits in to get the page proof set, and then we're good to go. So we should be looking at a publication, if we're extremely lucky, at the end of 2021, but more likely 2022. And it's been a blast to work on. We did it all digitally through Google Docs and Discord, and we would meet. So my team is with David Parecka and Brett Bartlett. We meet about 2 hours every day and have been since the beginning of the pandemic to churn out texts. And we've been working on some other projects that we've got to keep under wraps until we've got things more finalized. But the Ficino one is the one that's been brought to fruition. So it shines light on a sort of different facet of Ficino, or at least a facet that's not really well known in his popular conception. Scholars of Ficino, they know that Ficino fairly well as the priest, the Catholic priest Ficino, but not everybody is really up to speed on that, because a lot of people get their Ficino narratives from Francis Yates and D.P. Walker and things like that. So they think of Ficino more as a magician than a priest. And he was kind of all of these things, a priest, physician, magician, all of these various disciplines really bled into each other at the time. So that was a big part of Ficino, was trying to encapsulate a huge array of knowledge. And we see that in, his Platonic theology. We see that he was very well versed in theology and in ancient philosophy. And then in the De Christiana Religione, he's familiar with the patristic literature and with polemical literature, like anti-Jewish and anti-Islamic polemical literature. And then in later works like De Vita Libri Tres, we get the physician, astrologer side of him. And around this period, he was translating as well the works of Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, Iamblichus, and so forth. And he starts to, have more of that in his work. So he has a lot of different facets. And this work was from kind of his midlife, around when he was 40 years old and becoming a priest.
So this is the period when he was in the process of becoming a priest, and I'm guessing he can be sort of less radical in that. He has to be a little bit more conservative as becoming a priest. Would that be right?
Yeah. So what I sort of postulate is that he was trying to demonstrate, well, first off, he was trying to marry religion and philosophy. That's his primary goal. Is he thinks that the scholastics have severed religion from philosophy, and now they've become two separate things. And he thinks in ancient times, in wiser times, philosophy and theology were married. They were one thing. And he sees that in Plato, in Pythagoras, in Zoroaster, in Hermes, and so forth. So he's not so much trying to resurrect paganism, but he's trying to demonstrate that there was this logocentric theology that stands outside of time, and it's the theology of the eternal priest doing the eternal sacrifice, and that man is made in the image of this priest doing this sacrifice. And so you get this sort of Neoplatonic cascade of images whereby man sacrifices in his primordial state to the highest principle. And so in doing so, he is mimicking the image of God doing that. And so in De Christiana Religione, he's very much trying to marry his Platonism that he got from translating the works of Plato during the 60s, and the Corpus Hermeticum as well with things like hymns of Proclus and Orphic hymns. And he's trying to make a theology that encompasses the two, but he's demonstrating his good faith in using that theology then against Jews and Muslims. Because so a lot of people concentrate on this idea that he is constructing this Prisca Theologia narrative, and he is certainly doing that. But in the second half of the book, which is a lot drier, that's the book that derives from these converso polemicist sources like Jerome of Santa Fe and Paul of Burgos and Ricoldo of Montecrucis. And these guys were medieval Dominican polemicists, conversos usually, who left Judaism, took up the cloth, and then wrote anti-Jewish polemics using Jewish literature. And I think that Ficino is tapping into that current because those people used their anti-Jewish theological polemics to prove their own good faith. Ficino could use their ideas, nestle them within his Platonic synthesis, and then use that to demonstrate his good faith. And, the work was not super popular. It was more so an attempt to inaugurate his future Platonic endeavors, because he hadn't published any of them. He hadn't published his translations of Plato. He hadn't published his Platonic theology until 84. And then he also translated the De Christiana Religione into Italian very quickly. His sources were in Latin, so he wrote it in Latin, but then it was translated into Italian. And that, the intention behind that is to popularize, is to disseminate, is to spread this idea of a Christocentric, Platonic synthesis, and make it accessible to people who aren't necessarily schoolmen. And so you could slot that into his humanist side as somebody who's trying to write in the vulgar tongue of the day, which was increasingly more and more fashionable during the 15th century. But yeah, so I think that definitely he was trying to use this work to prove his good faith as a priest and somebody, and you get all these references in his works where he's saying like, look, I'm no less a Christian than a Platonist. He's always stressing that whatever he does, in as much as he's a Platonist, he's also, he's mainly a Christian. And in the De Vita, he says, I prescribe talismans and potions and things like that, but I only do so insofar as it's for the healing properties and for the good. And I don't recommend anything that the church is against. And so that's the kind of approach that Ficino has. He explores certain topics, but he always has this discourse of subordinating himself to the will of the church, which is, not uncommon, and it's especially makes sense as a priest. But by and large, I think that Ficino took up the cloth because his main aim was to unite philosophy and religion. And so he did that in himself. And then in De Vita, we get that fleshed out even more, where he becomes this philosopher, priest, physician, magus, kind of all around, Zoroastrian magus type figure who's a polymath and does it all.
So what does this all say? So first of all, let me recap. So you're translating On the Christian Religion, which Ficino wrote in his 40s, and he's sort of in a midway point in his encounter with the Neoplatonic tradition, which, as you're saying, it's more of a way of understanding how that tradition sort of was in conversation, or it was like one of the main sources of Christianity in ancient times. And so he's kind of more rediscovering how Christianity and Neoplatonism have a lot, it's a similar style of theology, right? But so what does this all say about the relationship of religion and magic, especially as we're reconsidering this this view of Ficino that begins with Ficino the Magus? So why does he then turn to do De Vita? How does magic fit in to religion?
So I suppose if it's from the position of Ficino, I guess if we look at the 70s in his life, he's not really talking about magic. There is no magic at all in De Christiana Religione, which might, come as a disappointment to some people, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. And he starts to get interested in that stuff, I think, more so as he discovers the Neoplatonists in more detail, because up until the 70s, the main Neoplatonists he was involved with was Proclus. And of course, this was Proclus through various translators. And then, of course, there's also Dionysius the Areopagite, who's the most important. And he puts him upstream. He's not the pseudo Dionysius of the 6th century. He's the disciple of Paul, from whom all other later Platonists usurped his doctrine. It's very clear that Ficino thought that they had taken the teachings of Dionysius in order to elucidate the ancient theology, the Prisca Theologia. So I think in studying, and Ficino claims, and it's probably not true, that it was Pico who, on the year or the day rather that Ficino was publishing his Platonic corpus, his complete translations of Plato, that he encountered Pico, who suggested to him that he should translate Plotinus after that. And so Ficino claims Pico prodded him to translate Plotinus, and then he did so. And then from Plotinus, he got into the later Platonists. And I think, Iamblichus falls under this aegis. And it's in there that he sees the Iamblican theurgy. And he sees, oh, look, this isn't base magic. This is like this lofty manipulation of symbols, of symbola, and it's an attempt to, it's theurgy, it's God working. This isn't conjuration of demons, which we see again and again. Ficino is very uneasy with this idea of the magic of goetic magic, or any sort of magic that has any sort of intercourse with demons. And he is very much into this, I guess, Neoplatonic magic, and that has its roots, or it was a tradition that today we call the Hermetic tradition. If we're going to talk about the practical magic side of the Hermetic tradition, rather than just the theoretical Corpus Hermeticum style Hermetic texts. And you know, those works, they didn't really make that distinction between magic and religion. It was one, and science even, it was one big seamless endeavor to become, you know, unified with God through the active intellect, to essentially saturate one's intellect with knowledge to the point that the active intellect descends and comes down on the passive human intellect, and they become one thing. And that is the true goal of the sage, is to perfect the intellect and achieve one's perfect nature. And that's done through a fullness of knowledge. So it's a kind of, you know, Ficino, I don't think necessarily believed this, right? Ficino was a Christian. And so there is a Christian reception point of view to this Hermetic tradition of perfect nature that both Ficino and Pico talk about, not directly, but obliquely, that the goal of man is felicitas, is happiness, or this kind of transcendent bliss where you cleave to God and join his throne room as a kind of spirit. You don't ever, well, and this is a distinction between Pico and Ficino. In Ficino, he didn't like this Averroan idea that the soul became dissolved in the active intellect, that the one, you know, that the soul was essentially annihilated in the one. He preferred this idea that the soul is immortal like God, because it's a spark of the divine. It's like, it's a kind of lesser God in a way, and it goes to be eternally blissful with God, but separate from him. It just like cleaves to God. It doesn't necessarily, and that ties into, you know, Jewish ideas of devakut and so forth. But in Pico, he was more interested in that self-annihilation in the one, and that was a kind of blissful kiss of death experience. So that's how the prophets get wrapped up to heaven. They get kissed by God, and they exchange breaths, and then their souls, their spirits mingle in one breath, and the prophet is annihilated. And so Ficino and Pico are tapping into these currents that are, you know, were around in the Islamic world, and that were, you know, shared by the Brethren of Purity. They're a big player in this, the Ikhwan al-Safa. And we get Maimonides in Egypt talking about, you know, reacting to use the YouTube jargon, some of these ideas that were floating around in Ibn Washia and in the Brethren of Purity. Not that those are connected, those are two different things, but both Ibn Washia and the Brethren of Purity are major sources for the Picatrix. And so the Picatrix,
Let me stop you here.
Yep.
Before we move on to the Arabic sources, and I'd just like to pause with Pico for a moment. You know, Pico being the guy that I was obsessed with for years, and interested viewers can go watch my or listen to my interview with Dan over on the Modern Hermeticist channel, where we talked about Pico for quite a bit. I was interested in Pico and Pseudo Dionysius. So I've been, you know, dying to ask you about what you're learning about Ficino's Neoplatonic book club, and I'm curious about the mechanics of how, you know, these guys were kind of passing these texts back and forth, but especially in how the beef arose between Pico and Ficino. And, you know, Pico's this brash young man who wasn't always very, you know, tactful, which is a big feel for me, and kind of offended Ficino at one point. So can you speak to the book club and the beef?
Yeah, so I suppose by the book club you mean the academy,
Right,
or
the
the
so-called
so-called academy, and I think that that's not a bad way to call it, as a book club, to type sort of defang the idea of the Platonic Academy. The only problem is that they used the term academy, so they actually like thought of themselves as LARPing an academy. and they use that language, but I think it is more correct to call it something like a book club or an oration club, where they write speeches and poetry and stuff for each other and read philosophy and talk about it, and like a salon. I like to call it a salon. And so, where were the Platonic works coming from? They were coming from Greece, and they were coming from the fall of Constantinople, and the scholars who, leading up to that moment, were fleeing and settling in Italy, in Florence. We have Manuel Chrysoloras is a big name. Gemistos Platon is the big name when it comes to Plato, because he was lecturing at the Council of Ferrara on the differences between and similarities between Plato and Aristotle. And that became a really big theme of the Renaissance, was how to reconcile these two thinkers, or what even were the problems that arose between Plato and Aristotle. And I would say that that's a good place to segue into where Ficino and Pico differed. And that is that Ficino, in his, as the master of his book club, was, he was the Discord moderator, and he was very distinctly anti-academic in tone. He was very like hostile to university learning and the various currents that were going about in the university. Pico, on the other hand, was not. He had been to various universities, Padua, Paris, and so forth, and he had learned from the various Aristotelian giants, like Elia del Medico, for example, one of his Jewish Averroist teachers. And so Ficino, had this hostile anti-academic attitude, whereas Pico thought that was a little bit too much. He liked Ficino's Platonism, but he also thought that Ficino was maybe brushing aside some of the more pertinent discussions in the academy and not taking them seriously. And so what he wanted to do, his major project as the Prince of Concord, was to marry Aristotle and Plato, and that is specifically, Ficino's Plato with the university's Aristotle. And being the brash young superstar theologian type guy that Pico was, he challenged Ficino all the time and was happy to kind of incite some controversy, whereas Ficino's tendency is to paper over or gloss over their differences. And even Pico could be attacking Ficino, and Ficino could be praising Pico around that same time for having a correct error. He's like, the universities are overrun with two types of Aristotelians, the Alexandrians and the Averroans. But then there are true Aristotelians like Pico della Mirandola, who interpret Aristotle correctly. So he would say that in a letter in his, I think, introduction to the Plotinus's Aeneas, which is 1492. And, in the same breath, Pico would write a treatise like De Ente et Uno and argue that being and the one are one thing, that they are synonymous, whereas the old school Platonic position is that the one is more rarefied than being. Being is lower on the hierarchy of being, if you will, than the one, whereas Pico is saying no, they're the same thing, being and the one. And that's, I think, one of the major points of difference between Pico and Ficino. And it's something that Ficino kind of glosses over. He doesn't take it too seriously. Like, he doesn't see these as fundamental differences that necessarily like ruin his whole project. But to Pico, they are. Like, to Pico, he's saying like, look, you can either be right or you can believe what the Neoplatonists believe. And so I think it was Brian Copenhaver who said the solution to Pico's problem of resolving Plato and Aristotle is quite Aristotelian. So, and I think that that's true. And now in all this, we haven't even spoken about Kabbalah, which in a way becomes the Pico's tool in a sense in order to reconcile, let's say, apophatic and cataphatic theologies. He can bridge the gap between Platonism and Aristotelianism using Jewish mysticism, and that's because he kind of reconceptualizes it in a way where he can then make it say whatever he really wants it to say, as opposed to what the rabbis would have said. But that's an entirely other story. But it suffices to say that Kabbalah does play just as an important part as Aristotle and Plato, and that Ficino and Pico's debates usually are philosophical in nature. They're not really necessarily super personal or anything like that.
That's a good point to bring up when I call it a beef.
Yeah.
And so the last question I want to ask about Ficino and Pico is, what about what the so-called post-Plotinian Platonism? I know that Ficino was immersed in Proclus, but also both Ficino and Pico were debating, the finer points of interpreting Plotinus. And some scholars have pointed to the kind of post-Plotinian, in Iamblichus and Proclus, theurgy is necessary because unlike in Plotinus, where you always have this undescended self, this undescended soul aspect of yourself sort of up in the heavens, for Iamblichus and Proclus, if I've got this correct, there's a kind of a disconnect. And so you need theurgy to sort of like reestablish this link with the gods. Where is the Ficino and Pico debate vis-a-vis these questions of theurgy and Neoplatonism and the difference between Plotinus and the later Neoplatonists?
So I will give a caveat that I haven't studied in depth because a lot of the stuff I've been looking at was in the 1470s, whereas this stuff is more in the 1490s. But that said, I'm pretty sure that the answer to this is that for Ficino, it is the theurgy. The theurgy is important, as in the sacraments. It's the sacraments that do the God working. And so he was, the kind of priest that did the mass, he performed the sacraments. And in doing so, he, made the presence of Christ real. And that is, to him, I think, restoring the bridge between humanity and God. Because in Neoplatonism, you're not fallen. You're just like this pendulous elastic band that has been stretched from your primordial station. But in Christianity, that band has been broken, and only Christ can bridge the gap between you and your soul's highest state. And so I think that the one of the mediating factors in that is the communion, is the sacrament of the wine and the bread and the mass and all the other sacraments.
So what about in Pico, though? People talk about Pico as being into this intellectual ascent, right? Does he find the sacraments as necessary, or does he think you can just do it by doing Kabbalah and philosophizing? Does he have a kind of a different theurgical take?
I think his take is more what we would call poetic, and more of this love, erotic. So again, Ficino, priest, he's not using these metaphors of Eros. Pico, being a layman and being more interested in his youth in poetry and courtly love and things like that, he was more interested in the Kabbalistic language of Maimonides. He thought Maimonides was a Kabbalist, which he wasn't, but
well, reading Abulafia, you might get that impression.
yes, exactly. And so there's this whole tradition of reading the Song of Psalms and the love poetry and that's in the Bible, and Pico reads that as this we talked about it earlier, this erotic kiss of death that eviscerates the body and the soul, and returns the soul back to dissolution into the one. And so I think that, yeah, Pico was more following this mentalist model of poetic or erotic madness, and falling into a kind of ecstatic state through Kabbalah, because he says there are two kinds of Kabbalah. There's the practical Kabbalah, which he, like Abulafia, said involved the Sephirot, and then there's the speculativus Kabbalah, and that's the visionary Kabbalah, and that involves the divine names. And so in his mind, you can use the divine names in order to allow the intersexual dynamics of God to operate, because he's envisioning this essentially triad of triads that you climb back up, and man is a kind of tetractys, and he's trying to dissolve himself back into the oneness of God. And so, yeah, I think that Pico's approach was far more speculative than theurgical, or was more like mental, if you want to call it that. I don't know if that's a good idea. That seems like a modern way of thinking about it, because they didn't think about it as that. But yeah, I think that might be the difference, was that Ficino would be more theurgical in his approach, being a priest, and Pico less so. And then there's the whole question of astrology, right? Which is that Ficino accepts astrology, but with some reservations, and then Pico just hates it outright.
Right. So
thinks every aspect of it is crap.
And one of the things that you've really helped me to appreciate about magic and the tradition of the Picatrix, which we're going to turn to look at. So we're rewinding the clock a few centuries to get into Islamic magic. So why do we need to look back toward the Brethren of Purity, these philosophical movements in the Islamic world, and the magic of the Picatrix? How does that help to explain or flesh out the relationship of magic and theology and these guys? And I'm thinking also, you really helped me to appreciate that this is an astral magic, right? In the Picatrix, it's all about astrology. So what happens between them and Pico to get Pico thinking of magic in such an anti-astrological way?
Right. So probably the best place to start thinking about this is just the title of the Picatrix in the Arabic. It is the goal of the sage, the Ghayat al-Hakim. And so what is the goal of the sage? And this was a question that was heavily debated by all manner of philosophers, going back to antiquity. You get it in Iamblichus in the closing of his book. He's talking about what is true success, what is eudaimonia, what is the final highest aspiration of mankind. And for the people who assembled the Picatrix, the highest aspiration of mankind is to know God. but God is everything. Like, and so in order to know God, you must know everything. And then you become one with that overarching intellect that it's, and, you know, they use the language of spheres and circles in order to expand one's mind, and grow the sphere of their awareness into the sphere of the active intellect. So that was one approach, and that was the approach that the Islamic scientists took. And it makes sense that they would take that approach because they don't have the competing model, which is this Christological, theurgical, pseudo-Dionysian model, which creates the third crust over top of the celestial world in the Christian world. And so Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino, they're, you know, they think astrology is cool and all right, it's okay, but it's subordinate to the super celestial world of the angels and the divine names, and that's where all the true magic happens. And that we don't even call it magic anymore, we just call it, I don't know, theology. You know, Pico says the true theology turns people into Metatron, and so they become the active intellect. Now in Picatrix, they didn't have this whole angelic hierarchy, Jesus and the Holy Spirit business. They're operating within an Islamic and Aristotelian and Platonic context. And so the highest aspiration for them is to make your mind the greatest one with the greatest mind. And what happens when you do that? What is the outcome of that? Well, in the Christian world, it's salvation, right? It's just you go to be one with God. But in the magical worldview, it's the ability to do magic. And so, for example, in Petrus Alfonsi's Disciplina Clericalis, you know, he was a converted Jew who knew all kinds of philosophical matters. And he said that there was a debate in his day and age, in the 10th century, or the 11th century rather, as to what is the seventh liberal art. What is the very highest and last liberal art? And in his mind, it boiled down to various parties arguing different things. And some people argued that it was philosophy was the highest of the liberal arts. And that was the goal of the sage, was to become a perfect philosopher. And then the other school of thought was grammar. It was to become, which is one of the first liberal arts, right? But apparently it's also the highest one. So I suppose this would be like the sophists' answer, that language constructs reality, and that everything is subordinate to language. And then the third answer, he says there are some more wicked people who would say that nigromancia, and that's astral magic, is the highest achievable goal for man. That's the sum of all the liberal arts. And that very much is the view that was espoused in the Picatrix and spread out through Spain in the 13th century, for example, that you could basically become a complete and full human being through the activation of your magical powers, through the actualization of the perfect nature, which is achieved through learning and through ritual. And so I think that that's kind of how those things tie together, is that later in the Renaissance, there become competing modes. I wouldn't even say later in the Renaissance, I would say starting in the 13th century, there are competing modes of thinking about what is the highest aspiration for mankind. And in the Christian world, of course, anybody dealing with talismans or whatever, what they're doing is they're being tricked by demons to do things that allow them to come into this world. So the demon will come and say like, oh, I'll do such and such a thing for you. If you manipulate this golden token and recite this special word and create this special smell, then the demon can come into this world, and they've fooled the magician. And you can see, going back to Augustine, in Augustine's City of God, talking about demonology, he's criticizing this stuff. So there's a real rich tradition, of people like Augustine blasting against the magic that you see in something like the PGM. That gets carried through to the Middle Ages with the universities in Paris, where you have guys like Bishop of Tempier or the Speculum Astronomiae, where they're talking about how there are different kinds of magic. There are demonic, and then there is natural magic, and that creates that fork between what is purely, let's say in our modern parlance, scientific, and then what is done through the influence of demons. So the Christian view in the Renaissance is that all of the stuff that's done in the Picatrix is this demonic stuff, but there are certain things in that book that can be extracted that are purely medicinal or natural, and that's what Ficino does in De Vita. And he doesn't mention the Picatrix by name, but he mentions it in a letter to his cousin Filippo Valori. That everything that was of value in the Picatrix, he extracted it and put it into his De Vita. So that's how he thought of the work. And so it's really difficult to talk about the influence of the Picatrix on the Renaissance, because people are always expecting you to talk about how one thing was like used, so that happened. There are some use cases in the materia medica and things like that, but more importantly, there are these theological reactionary currents where people are reacting to the idea of what constitutes a perfect sage, what is the highest aspiration of man. And so I think when I look at a document like the Oratio, the so-called Oration on the Dignity of Man by Pico, we get this story about how man can ascend to be with the angelic intellects and annihilate himself in God. And that is basically what man's dignity is, if anything. So, yeah, I think it's interesting to tease out these connections. And one of the explicit links is Johannan Alemanno, who is Pico's teacher in Hebrew, and he was explicitly interested in merging Kabbalah and astral magic. And so he has all these passages dealing with the Sephirot and the planets in parallel almost, but the planets are at a lower level. So it's very clear that the planets act on a lower octave than the Sephirot do. And the way he talks about talismans, or rather the Torah, the way he talks about doing mitzvot, it's very reminiscent of the language of magical talismans. And it uses the language of force operating across these various levels of the divine hierarchy. And so I think Pico, in encountering that stuff in Johannan Alemanno, writes against it in the Heptaplus and in the Disputationes contra Astrologiam Divinatricem. Those are his anti-astrological disputations. So yeah, it's a very oblique and torturous path, but there are definitely like connections from that magical worldview to the theological worldview of the Renaissance. They are interconnected in many ways that I think have been underappreciated, but they're there.
So, the interested viewer can check out your audiobook of Pico's oration, and Recently, you've even done a text of Iamblichus, right? There's lots of great stuff on your channel. I also highly recommend Leona Seif's book on the influence of Arabic philosophy on Renaissance occultism. Before we go, there was something that got your goat when I mentioned that, one of those magical trolls in a news group, said, oh, well, the Picatrix translation by Attrell and Pareca, they really make these, these beautiful magicians seem like druggies, because you guys kind of translated all the terms of the pharmacological agents in the Picatrix. How do you respond to that criticism?
So, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is more indicative of the person with the grievance, and how they make these kind of distinctions between, drugs and materia medica, or just substances in general. We make it really clear, I think it's on page 28, that we in no way means to suggest that the magic is delusions, is these drug-addled delusions. That's the wording we use. And I think even Christopher Warnock, in his review, he was happy to say that he was glad to see that we thought that as well, like that there was talk of psychoactive ingredients, but that we didn't suggest that this was just sort of like drug magic. It's just that when you're writing an introduction, you have to, you want to write something, and you don't want to just recapitulate what all the other introductions have said. So you want to say something different. The French edition, for example, mostly focused on astrological material, which is fine. We wanted to focus a little bit on some of the materia medica, and some of the discoveries that we had made in that. And so we focused on that, and we found that, there are some of these substances are really dangerous or psychoactive, like there's datura and things like that, which, you don't want to mess around with. And to the accusation that we're trying to make it seem more drug-like, I would give the rebuttal of, well, then why did we translate certain terms that would neuter the drug content? So, for example, one of the Latin words is laudanum, but laudanum, as we understand it to be opium, that didn't come about until Paracelsus's time. What that is actually talking about is labdanum, which is a kind of resin. So we made that correction. If we were trying to make it seem more psychedelic or whatever, we would have seen, oh, laudanum, there's more drugs here than we suppose that there are. Yeah, so I think maybe some have thought that by focusing too much on these things, or by drawing too much attention, I'm overemphasizing them. And I can try not to do that. But I don't think that that necessarily reflects my personal view.
So if these guys weren't medieval druggies, then what can you explain the role of a psychoactive like datura in the magic of the Picatrix just a little bit?
The real distinction between ingredients list, what ingredients are psychoactive and which are that